My value is linked to the money I do or don't have.
In this interview, pay particular attention to our discussion around healthcare in the movie and TV industries and the hamster wheel that everyone seems to be on. I'll say it'll shock you.
Yeah, I agree. It shocked us. And it begs the question why we make it so hard for actors and musicians trying to get their big break, AKA startup stars. You're hearing that term here first, and I'm publicly giving Jen Tullock the copyright privileges to that. Welcome to Living Not So Fabulously. So, David, be honest. If you had the option to sever your professional self from your personal self, would you do it?
Oh, no, absolutely not. That would mean forgetting you. And let's be real, I forget enough of what you tell me on a daily basis.
No, how rude is that? But fair. Besides, who wants to separate their professional self from their work self and not share the best parts of themselves with their favorite person?
Exactly. And speaking of brilliant people who blur all the boundaries in all the best ways, Jen Tullock is a Kentucky-born actor, writer, and all-around scene stealer, best known as Devon in Severance on Apple TV and Anita St. Pierre on HBO's Perry Mason.
She's a Sundance alum, a stroke survivor, and a proud lesbian who once said her goal in life was to be a character actress who gets fan mail from librarians. So she's our kind of people.
Exactly. Welcome to the show, Jen.
Thanks, y'all. I'm so happy to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah, so you portrayed queer actors on several shows, including Severance and as Anita St. Pierre on Perry Mason. How do you infuse your personal experience as a queer person into roles like that?
Those two were certainly different beasts to take on. With Severance, my character is married to a man, but our show creator, Dan Erickson, and I had always discussed the fact that she had probably had a pretty splashy time in her 20s and dated people of all genders. And I always joke that I think she probably played rugby at Oberlin and had like a hot rugby girlfriend, named like Tank or something. And then met her husband, fell in love and settled down. But we had talked about before the episode where it sort of revealed officially that she was queer, that she had been. And I said, something we don't see very often represented, I think, in TV and media at large is are queer people in straight relationships. And I've never ventured that way myself. I'm about as gay as a sequined handbag, but I did think it was important for that character to distinguish. Whereas with Anita on Perry Mason, that was obviously such a different situation, playing someone who was closeted for obvious reasons in 1933, and having to tackle everything that entailed, both story-wise and just physically, what it looked like to be in a relationship with someone for which you could have been jailed. So that was really special and bittersweet to play.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Severance, if we understand correctly, you sort of improvised the line revealing that Devon was a queer character.
Dude, I left you like 5 messages. Are you better?
No, well, I'm still sick.
Well, you can't not pick up when we're doing corporate espionage. The floodlight thing was a bust, right? Because I have had an idea that is a little dumber.
Okay, Devon.
Do you remember the rich lady from baby camp, the one I kind of had a crush on?
Do you have that kind of autonomy, and were the producers and directors all prepared for that coming out?
We're pretty biblical with the script on that show, I think, because it's so meticulous and focused and intentional. It's not a huge improv-heavy set. But because of the space, I think that my character and Adam Scott's character, his outie, occupy on the show, I think we probably have a little bit more wiggle room because they wanted to feel lived in and fraternal. So that was one of those moments where we were just being cheeky. If I remember correctly, it was the end of a long shoot day, and it was one of the last takes, and I just said it off the cuff. And I was so pleased that they kept it, and I ended up texting Dan, and I was like, is this okay? I think I accidentally outed her. And he was like, no, we'd always talked about that, so we were eager to keep it in. But it was funny to see the internet response to it. It was wild.
So, Jen, that's really interesting. Not surprising, but it's really interesting that, of course, the internet caught on fire when you say, right, when you outed your character. So, what were some of the things that they were saying, and what was your reaction? How did you handle that?
It was twofold for me, or two-pronged, I should say. One, I was just thrilled that people, straight and queer, seemed really excited at the prospect. There were a lot of responses I saw online that were like, "Oh, this makes so much sense, of course." Um, but one thing I did have to contend with and felt like it was my responsibility to contend with was when fans would say, "Oh, well, that's why, there's a fissure in her marriage. That's why she's with somebody like Rick and who we don't think is right for her." And I get really defensive of their relationship, both because I trust why they're together as characters and because of my personal love for Michael Turness, the actor who plays Rickon so much. And I had to say, no, it's not because she's actually gay. I think this is a pansexual person who fell in love with this man and has, for whatever reason, decided to carve out a life with him. And I think that it was important for me to respond to some of those and say, no, it's there are plenty of people in my life that are queer and have dated and had meaningful relationships with all genders that found themselves in an opposite gendered or hetero, normative relationship and felt a little, erased and because of that. And I respect that feeling. So I wanted to make sure people knew it wasn't, oh, well, she's gay. And so that's why she's not all over her husband. I think she's just in a boring marriage because they just had a baby. And we were in an interview once and somebody said, why are they together? We don't get it. And Michael Turnus said, have you ever been to an airport? Like, have you ever seen what a marriage actually looks like? And I thought that was so well said.
Yes, absolutely.
But I appreciate that you had the courage to throw that in there and that the producers and directors kept it there, because I don't know that straight people can truly understand what it means to get that indication that there's somebody like me in this particular world that I can understand with. And it was done with such authenticity and not like overblown in any way, shape, or form. It was just said in
Yeah.
passing and more like real life.
Yeah.
As it should be. I think there was the Reddit lore that came out after that time. I had friends send me a lot, and I was tickled reading it, and that you tickled that people cared, but also um, making it a big coming out moment to me wasn't the focus because
Mhm.
my hope is that in life that's what we're moving towards, that
Mhm.
our queerness, our gayness is just one aspect of many, about ourselves. And for Devin, that's certainly true. I think that she didn't leave behind women to be with a man. She's a queer person who dated people before Rickon and is now with Rickon, and also normalize married people having crushes. I think, like, it doesn't mean that you're stepping out on your partner. I think that uh, it was a funny moment for me to be like, yeah, I just met this really cool, you know, uh, gorgeous person at the birthing cabin, and woo. It's funny, the actress who plays Abby, the character Devin's talking about in that moment. Her name's Nora Dale. She's great. And I texted her and I said, listen, sorry to accidentally drag you into this too, but we're in it now.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for sharing that. If you're just joining us, we're talking with actor and writer Jen Tullock. So you've mentioned that, excuse me, you mentioned that fiction is cheaper than therapy. Do you mind elaborating on that? What does that mean exactly?
I think, like many people that were raised in restrictive religious environments, I was raised in an incredibly conservative evangelical community in Kentucky. And I knew early on that I didn't fit there in many ways, namely my queerness, but also just being a weirdo. And uh, I think that I had always been acting any way that I can. Like I was taking, I would, if it meant about being on stage at church, yes, I would take it. If it meant finally convincing my parents to let me audition for a community theater production of Fiddler on the Roof in Southern Indiana, I took it. And let me tell you, I dazzled. I dazzled in the ensemble. But I
Nice.
think there's. I'll tell you what it is. When I was young and saw Funny Girl for the first time, which is the story of I think so many actors, um, I thought, oh, that that looks closer to the outline of how I see myself. And my grandparents, my beloved grandparents, did a wonderful job of introducing me to old jazz. Like they played Bill Evans for me and Nat King Cole and Anita O'Day and Betty Carter and showed me all the old MGM musicals. And I remember thinking I felt such respite and comfort when I was living inside of those musicals that I wanted to cultivate a life that kept me in close proximity to those stories and that genre that felt like my friend. I was like, I just want to be with my friends. And these
Mhm.
old movies were my friends. And so I I think I was knew early on that I wanted to be in show business. And I guess to answer your question more pointedly, when you're having to channel intense feelings as a character, I find it easier to grab when you have the mask of a character
Mhm.
than it is for me in my waking life, where I think I probably have some more restrictions I've put on myself emotionally. So
Mm.
the irony of having to live a truthful moment that is make believe is not lost on me, and probably my therapist either.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I really appreciate you sharing that. For two reasons. One, I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, so I know exactly where you're coming from in that kind of being raised in that kind of household, and the idea that fiction is something that you would. I gravitated towards. Literally, whenever my parents would go out of town when I was a teenager, I had set aside money so that I could go to the video store and rent queer themed videos that I could only watch when they were out of town. And so that was kind of my therapy during that time period. We're talking about my later teens. And so I completely understand that. It kind of speaks to this idea that sometimes we do need to, as queer people, hide some of the aspects of our lives, and some of that sometimes is financial. Have there ever been any financial constraints that have shaped your creative endeavors?
Oh my God, financial restraints have shaped every aspect of my life. I think being raised in a conservative Christian environment meant that scarcity was often mythologized and ultimately weaponized because it was part of a system that posited that you had no control of your predestined life. And so
Mm,
any moment of abundance or scarcity was divinely appointed. And so if it was
right.
abundance, well, you must have done something right. And if it was scarcity, well, you must have not done something right. And that that honestly colored my relationship with money. It still does, for a long time in a really detrimental way. I think, um, I was raised in an environment where there wasn't money, and the money that there was often, um, mismanaged, and by no fault of my parents. They were very young when they had me, and I think I realized early on that this is also very Southern. My mother's from Arkansas, my dad's from North Carolina, I was brought up in Kentucky, and the mythologizing scarcity is very Southern. It's very Tennessee Williams to me. It's like, "Well, we can't do that." "Well, we
Mhm.
don't have the money to do that." And it would be, there would be moments where I would say, "Oh, I think a new pair of shoes for school, like, my shoes are falling apart." And he'd be like, "What do you think this is?" But we don't have that money, and they were doing my parents were
Right.
doing their best. Like, they were struggling, but I remember thinking at that time, "Oh, my value is linked to the money I do or don't have." And
Mm,
I think there are certainly ways to live a life with not very much money and not feel that way, but I think it was baked into the culture, especially as a woman, in the
uh-huh.
church. It was like, "Well, the Lord will grant you what you need, and if you are not
Mhm.
granted that, then maybe that's something to examine."
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Sort of weaponized in a way. So I'm curious, with all the anti-LGBTQ plus initiatives today, thinking about your backstory, do you think a young Jen Tullock from Kentucky still feels hopeful today?
I think I have to. Otherwise, my head will pop off my body and roll across the floor like a bowling ball. It's a terrifying time in this country. It's certainly terrifying in other parts of the world for queer people. I think especially like our trans siblings right now, that keeps me up at night. But I have a 10-year-old stepson, and as cliched as it is, it's true. My relationship with him has altered the way I think about hope. And
Mm.
I I look at him and the freedom with which he lives his life, and the friends of his that are gender expansive, and so very much themselves, and so situated comfortably in themselves in a way that I didn't have access to at that age. And I think, well, if they're doing it now, we're gonna be okay. And,
Mm.
um, Yeah, but it's scary. It's scary, and I think for those of us that are lucky enough to live in communities that feel safe for queer folks, it's also
Mhm.
been a great wake up call to remember that just because your state is blue doesn't mean there isn't bigotry. And I've
Mhm.
experienced since this current president has been back in office, um, a an energy shift and moments where I thought, oh, this person that lives in my very progressive New York community feels deputized now to say something um, questionable about queer
Mhm.
people that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, it's an interesting word, deputized. It's very poignant.
Yeah, it definitely is. Speaking of another scary experience in your life, you went through having a stroke, and you have a solo show about this. You talk about it in your show. I'm sorry. You shall inherit the earth. um, how did this health event affect your financial planning or perspective?
I think it affected me generally in the sense that any semblance of security or safety or implied like right to safety and health went out the window. I think this probably is
Mhm.
often the case for people that suffer any type of sudden health event. Um,
Mhm.
it shook me in a couple of ways, namely that when I didn't know what was going to happen when I'd gotten to the hospital and I had expressive aphasia, so I wasn't really able to speak properly. Um, and they said, "Oh, we need to just make sure you don't go to a brain bleed because that's where things can get really dicey." I thought, "Oh, right, this isn't okay, this is happening." And I remember I talk about this on my show, but being, pushed into the MRI machine, and I found myself praying, and I hadn't prayed in decades, and
Mm.
whether or not it was by rote or, just sort of a trauma response from muscle memory, I don't know, but all I know is that my body did something that my mind did not give consent to, and I remember thinking, I have to look at this. If I make it
Mm.
through this and I'm fine on the other side, which, thankfully I was, I need to look at this moment and what that means for me. And
Mhm.
um, but as far as finances are concerned, I don't have to tell you, the American medical system is a gauntlet. And
Mhm.
the health insurance system is a gauntlet. It is built to fail. It is a classist, capitalist system, in my opinion, that does not serve people the way that it could and should. And I was very lucky when I had my stroke that I had good health insurance through my job, and that I was able to get the care that I needed. But I also know, I was telling you before, when my wife and I were in France, I had like a little problem with my eye. I had this thing called neurovascularization of your cornea, which means I had like a blood vessel, content warning, like growing into my cornea, and it burst and it was bleeding in my eye. And
Oh.
I spent hours on the phone when we got back to the States finding someone that took my insurance. But the first doctor I saw said, "Well, you have to see a corneal specialist, otherwise you could lose vision in your eye." But I was like, "Well, I can't find anyone that takes my insurance," and out of pocket, it was gonna be astronomical. And I remember thinking,
Mhm.
"Yeah, this is how it happens." There's so many preventable health emergencies in our country because we make it nearly impossible to get care.
Right.
Absolutely. So please hold that thought. I want to continue this discussion right after this break. Welcome back to Living Not So Fabulously. We're talking with one of the stars of everyone's favorite dystopian sci-fi, Severance, Jen Tullock. So, continuing the discussion we were having before the break, Chappell Roan recently famously shared that the music's industry's inadequacies with covering performers' health insurance. How are the movie and television industries the same or different with healthcare coverage, especially for startup stars?
Yeah, for one thing, startup stars is the most generous description I've ever heard of a fledgling actor. I think that that's incredible. I'm gonna start referring to myself as a startup star. I think when we had the SAG and WGA strikes a couple years ago, which actually started the day before I had my stroke. I always joke that's why I had one, but everyone was doing their best during that time to negotiate better options. Um, with my union, and I'm in a couple, I know for Actors Equity, for stage actors, it functions a little differently, but with SAG, it's commensurate with your quarterly income, so you can lose it just as quickly as you got it.
Oh,
And I've
wow.
had friends that had insurance because they had worked enough in that quarter to have their insurance, have a health problem. I know a person I really like in LA, a gifted comedian was diagnosed with cancer and had just lost her insurance, but couldn't work enough to make it back because she was sick. And so
Oh, wow.
I know that people in the union are working hard to rectify that and make it more accessible to people, but it's tough, where we live under capitalism, and it's pay or play more often than not. And so
Mhm.
I think I'll speak only for myself, but you could be in a situation where you're on a successful show and maybe you've just shot a string of successful things, a big studio movie and a couple of shows. But then if you have a hiatus where you're not shooting, meaning you're not technically on payroll, you could be on the highest grossing show in the country and still lose your health insurance because you didn't technically
Wow.
have enough coming in for that quarter to maintain it. And now with the residual model being what it is, you know, now some of that changed during the strikes, which
Mhm.
is great. And I'm sure someone in the comments is going to correct me from the unis. I may be misquoting it, but well, most of the streaming shows did not give residuals until the
Mhm.
strike. So, but back in
Mhm.
the day, TV actors on network shows, you'd be good if you didn't work for a while. You had some residuals coming in that would maintain you and your insurance.
Right.
So it's an ever-changing
Wow.
landscape.
That's so convoluted and way harder than it needs to be.
Well, yeah, I think we have this kind of perception of you're on a big show, and once you've landed your big gig, your life is like, it's easy now.
Rose.
You just hit the
No,
easy button.
it's easy in the sense that it's wonderful to be a part of something I feel proud of, and it's amazing to have more access to other work. That for me has always been like the biggest win.
Mhm.
But no, none of it goes away. Like you can't uh for by no one's fault. We as everyone sort of knows now, it took a while to make these 2 seasons of Severance, and it was no one's fault. We COVID happened, and then the strikes happened. We keep joking, but, like, what's left? A hurricane, a tsunami, or an asteroid, to keep us from season 3, but, um, because of that, we were all scrambling to work elsewhere in between, but then when the strikes happened, we couldn't work at all. And
Mhm.
so
Right.
most of us went back to the stage, which was great, but not always the most lucrative endeavor. And it's one of the number one, I think, misconceptions about um, what I'll call middle class actors, which is working
Mm.
actors, consistently working actors, working on great things. Um, but you don't. Something I wish I had been told as a young actor, as a startup star, was um, uh, how much, what a big percentage of your income goes to other people. You know,
Mm.
Yeah.
you could be making more money, which is great, but you're paying lawyers, managers, agents, publicists, sometimes stylists out
Mhm.
of pocket, um, and those things sound elective or um, by choice, but they're not always. Like those are all
Mhm.
things that you need to sort of keep the train going, and
Mhm.
yeah. So it's like the more you make, the more you have to make to keep it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very insightful.
Definitely. So I'm going to kind of weave two questions here. We usually like to get when we get towards the end of the show, ask folks that we're interviewing, what is one piece of personal finance advice that you would give to the LGBT community? But I'm going to actually weave this in with this idea that you're talking about right now is of how do you cope with income fluctuations? Because we're seeing more and more queer people end up in 1099 roles and roles where they don't have
Contact work.
contract work. So do you have any suggestions or what piece of advice would you share with the community?
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me because I think oftentimes when you're raised uh, in a sort of unintentionally duplicitous life where you're having to hide part of yourself, where I'm 41 and coming out at 19, it still was um, it still wasn't a totally safe time to be out. In the workplace, you could still certainly be discriminated against or not hired altogether, especially if it were
Mhm.
straight men that were making the decisions. And
Mhm.
I'd flat out been told that before early on in my career. Um, that's not to say I suffered greatly. I've been very lucky in a lot of ways. But I think because a lot of queer people come from a scarcity place, whether it was because they were kicked out of their home or didn't feel safe in their home, that it is generally harder, I think, for queer folks to find consistency and to prioritize consistency because we were raised
Mm.
in a sort of chaos, in an emotional chaos, a cultural chaos. And so
Mhm.
my advice would just be by hook or crook, if you can get into therapy, for me, healing the first part of that experience is imperative to developing a healthy relationship with money, even if you don't have any. It took me
Mhm.
years to get to the point where, in a moment of financial tumult, I didn't go into total adrenal overdrive, where I was in my amygdala, where I was in like fight or flight. Um, I the greatest shame I've ever experienced in my life has been around money and the greatest terror and has been about because the worst case scenario did happen to me a couple times when I was younger. I did run out of money. I did sleep in my car a couple times, and, like, I did
Mm.
not have any resources, and then at points in my life, I was lucky enough to have folks that helped me, um, and eventually was able to work enough to survive and thrive, but I would just say it sounds impossible, but if you can find the mental health resources to try and separate the shame from the money you do or don't have, it's really, to me, very important.
That is
I
great advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for coming on the show, Jen Tullock. It's been a thrill having you.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to talk to you.
So I love that interview. Jen is so super insightful. So what was your takeaway?
So I think that Jen's take on how religion shapes our money beliefs is really powerful.
Mhm.
If those beliefs are hurting more than they're helping, it may be time to sever them or at least realign them with support from a therapist or even a financial therapist. I mean, did you know that many of our money habits are actually formed by the time we're age 7, oftentimes shaped by our family, our faith, or even fear?
Yeah, it's quite surprising. So, did you also know that there are certifications for financial therapy? If money stress runs deep for you, this might be the help that you need. For even deeper healing, check out the Trauma of Money certification. Explore Financial Therapy Association or the Trauma of Money Institute for more information.
Thanks for tuning in. Like what you see, scan the QR code and follow Yahoo Finance podcast for more videos and expert insights, because when you do, you get all of the financial insight with none of the creepy break room vibes.
Ooh.
And until next time, stay fabulous.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.